welcome to the webcast today. If you are having trouble connecting to your audio, please look over for the Quick Start menu at the top left hand of your screen, and then you'll be given an option to connect to audio via your computer or a phone. If you have any technical questions, you can log them in the chat box on the bottom right of your screen. You can also log questions for the presenters there as well. So we'd like to go ahead and get started, and I'll pass it over to Jim Rogan with USAID ECCN.
Thank you very much, Amy. I hope everyone can hear me. Good morning at least to those of you on the East Coast of the U.S., and welcome to today's webcast on the situation of education in Syria. My name is Jim Rogan, and I'm with USAID's Education in Conflict and Crisis Network, which is a community of practice composed of USAID education staff, implementing partners, and others working to increase equitable access and improve the quality of education in crisis and conflict-affected environments. Today, we're very pleased to host this important discussion about the state of education in Syria and specifically learn about the findings from a report carried out by RTI International in late 2016 for USAID's Middle East Bureau. RTI's work offers crucial insights into the key inputs into the education system, the education delivery systems inside Syria, how they vary across distinct areas, and the international community's response to the crisis. We're grateful to have with us one of the authors of the report, Nina Etyemezian, who is the Director of Program Development and Strategy for RTI International's Education Division. And we're also pleased to have Chris Capaci-Carnial, who is an Education Development Officer with USAID's Middle East Bureau. Today's webcast reflects USAID's ECCN's ongoing effort to share knowledge among practitioners, policymakers, and researchers in order to improve practice, particularly in these most challenging and compelling situations. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes. Simultaneously, as Amy has mentioned, on the right-hand banner, all of you will be able to use a live chat option for real-time exchange of questions and comments, which everyone can view. And at the end, we will set aside approximately 10 to 15 minutes to allow presenters to respond to questions, and then we'll wrap up. On a couple of final notes, this webcast will be uploaded on the ECCN website. We will be taking live notes of the webcast right now for anyone who prefers a written readout, and these can also be found on the right-hand banner under the chat box. So stay tuned to ECCN for a web page dedicated to this discussion. If anyone has not yet signed up to be a member of ECCN, we strongly encourage you to do so. And on that web page, you will be able to find blogs and discussions and also responses to any questions that we're not able to answer right now, given time constraints. I will now hand over to Chris to set the stage for today's presentation. So Chris, over to you.
And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also appreciate ECCN's support for this webcast hosting us today. If you can see me, you can see that Nina is sitting next to me. I'm going to move out of the way in just a minute and give her center stage. But I first just wanted to say, once again, thank you to RTI for carrying out this study. We really appreciate it. Nina worked closely with another colleague, Badr Araj. Unfortunately, he's unable to join us today, but we definitely wanted to make sure to acknowledge his excellent contributions to the study. In addition, in the room here, you can't see her, but our colleague from State Department NEA, Catherine Bou-Maron, who's a Foreign Affairs Officer, is sitting here with us. Okay, so if you may have seen in the announcement that there was a 3-page briefer that presented a snapshot of the state of education in Syria and provides a list of the resources that were consulted to put together this study. USAID's Middle East Bureau asked RTI to put together a report on this topic to learn more and to use as a foundation for our thinking on education in Syria. We wanted to dive deeper into certain topics and focus on geographic areas where the U.S. government is currently providing humanitarian assistance. So you'll see on this first slide, the 5 areas that we asked RTI to delve into are access to education, teacher availability and qualifications, curricula being used in schools, infrastructure and availability of schools, and safety and security as an impact on school participation. In addition to carrying out the literature review and putting together an annotated bibliography, a few interviews were conducted with implementers, and we wanted to do this to provide a deeper context and to discuss some of the findings that we were seeing in the reports and some of the analysis. However, as you can imagine, it was hard to find many who were able to spare the time for this type of discussion. So today, the analysis and the presentation reflects this work. I want to apologize in advance that we cannot share the larger report because it contains sensitive information with regard to the interviews. But our hope is that the webcast is the start of a more robust conversation and dialogue on how, as a community, we can better support education efforts inside Syria. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, ECCN, as well, for sponsoring this and helping us put it on. And thank you very much, Chris, and USAID as well, for asking us to do this really important work, which I think is going to hopefully inform discussions further as we move along. So as Chris said, this was essentially a review of the literature, a very deep review of the literature with, as you can see, 150 documents having been reviewed. In our review, we basically found 2 sets of studies that were particularly useful for us to understand what the situation in Syria in education is. One set of reports was basically produced by UNICEF's MENA Regional Bureau in Damascus, and it's a combination of the EMIS data they have access to because they have access to the government of Syria's EMIS data, as well as a survey they conducted in a small sample of both government of Syria controlled schools as well as schools that are in opposition-controlled areas. So the other set of useful information was provided by reports from the Assistance Coordination Unit that works out of Gaziantep. They also conducted, they didn't have access to the EMIS data, but they did conduct a more comprehensive survey in the northern governorates of Syria to find out information that basically pertains to all the inputs and indicators. And the findings from the 2 sets of reports corroborate each other, which was very good for us who are conducting the study because that meant that we were, the information we were finding was more or less the same across the board. Our study also looked more closely at the 3 highly contested areas of Daraa, Idlib, and Aleppo. As you can see right here, this is an administrative map of Syria with its 14 governors, including Daraa in the south and Aleppo and Idlib in the north. It's also to help you sort of situate where things are as we move along. So on the eve of the conflict, Syria enjoyed universal basic education for both boys and girls, and a robust system, certainly one with real issues that pertain to quality and relevance. Right, as you can see, a lot of the indicators were very positive in terms of enrollment and net enrollment and gross enrollment. A few additional details to help flesh out the picture of what education looked like right before the conflict began. So Syria had some 16,200 schools, the majority of which were co-educational. This is for grades 1 to 12, and had about 63,000 plus teachers, almost evenly divided between male and female. Modern Standard Arabic was and still is the language of instruction, and English or French are taught as a foreign language starting in grade 1. Curriculum subjects for grades 1 to 12 include Arabic language, a foreign language, mathematics, religious education, social studies, science, art education, and physical education. So, as a result of the conflict, a large part of the education system infrastructure has been destroyed, and the infrastructure is not just about the schools. There's about 1 in 4 schools that have been destroyed according to most reports, but also teachers moving around or dropping out of the profession, education officials not being able to do the job they need to do. Basically, 6 million children inside Syria are in need of humanitarian assistance. Over 2 million of them are out of school, and more than 1 million have not been reached by routine immunizations. So, what has happened? What's happened is drastic decreases in enrollment rates. Pre-primary enrollment has decreased by 89%. Basic level enrollment, basically, that's a combination of primary and lower secondary. Essentially, grades 1 to 9 have seen a 44% decrease in enrollment. Upper general secondary has decreased by 23%. And enrollment in technical vocational education has decreased by 64%. The situation does differ from governorate to governorate because obviously some places the conflict is more intense, other places less intense, and other places are relatively calm. So, for example, in contested areas such as the governorate of Aleppo, they have experienced enormous decreases in enrollment, while in calmer places like the governorate of Latakia, they're struggling under the pressure of large numbers of IDPs that are flooding their education system. So looking at the key education indicators, sort of drilling down a little more deeply across all areas, as we all know from watching the news, complete neighborhoods have been destroyed, as have many, many schools, and blanket air bombardment can be quite indiscriminate, so parents are rightfully afraid to send their children to school in many places. But apart from these security issues that impact access, other contributing factors include socioeconomic ones caused by, obviously, lack of jobs, lack of income, depreciating currency, and lack of means, leading to child labor, child marriage even, and parents are also struggling with financial barriers to schooling because of fees sometimes or other costs that have to be paid to schools. Regulation on school and class size limit access to schooling, particularly in overcrowded areas. And there is a lack of cohesion across different areas all over Syria in very different parts of the education, and we'll talk a little more about those as we continue. Now, in terms of quality, as I already mentioned earlier, data on educational quality and learning outcomes are limited, but there are indications in the literature on some major challenges, in addition to the fact that before the conflict started, the system had already had some issues. So curricula are outdated and focus on rote memorization. They certainly not lack the needed psychosocial support elements for traumatized children and teachers, making the system ill-equipped to function adequately under the current circumstances. All this is compounded by a lack of learning materials and uncertainty related to the national grade 9 and grade 12 examinations that are only offered in Government of Syria controlled areas. Mechanisms by which prior learning can be recognized in non-Government of Syria managed schools are lacking. Syrian government officials essentially reject certificates issued by schools in non-government controlled areas. Moving on to, there we go, challenges to the management and retention of teachers. You know, kind of a very important element of any education system delivery. Teacher supply has very much followed the same trends we described earlier that are related to children's enrollment. So lack of safety and security is a major factor in teacher shortages. So that while Governorate of Hasaka, which some conflict, has lost 1,600 teachers, Latakia has gained 4,800 teachers because of all the IDPs it has and has no way of using these teachers. Displacement, loss of life, immigration outside of Syria, and especially the lack of appropriate or sufficient remuneration has affected teacher recruitment and retention. What's been the international response? So the international community's initial reaction was understandably ad hoc because it was so kind of overwhelming. Although a more coherent response framework has emerged since the UN Security Council voted to allow cross-border operations from Jordan and Turkey. The whole of Syria response, as you can see on this slide, loosely coordinates the relief and development efforts that are delivered into Syria from 3 hubs. Damascus for government-controlled areas, Gaziantep for opposition-controlled areas. Gaziantep is also where the majority of NGOs, both international and local, operate from, and Amman for parts of southern Syria. By all accounts, the education sector continues to be significantly underfunded, and international relief bodies, international NGOs, local NGOs continue to advocate and lobby internationally for increased attention to the sector. Here's a really interesting map right there. So this map is from February 2016. One presumes much has changed since then because the situation is so very fluid. But this gives you an idea of sort of who the players are inside Syria. For the purposes of the study we did, we classified the groupings into 3 types, basic types. The first are areas under the oversight of the Syrian interim government, and the acronym is SIG, which I will use as we go along just because it's shorter than saying the Syrian interim government. The SIG is basically an alternative government of Syria opposition, which was formed by the opposition umbrella group. The second type of areas, if you will, are those controlled by the Syrian government, the current regime. And the third type we have termed other, which includes areas within Syria that are under the control of entities such as ISIS or other similar radical religious groups. I'm going to go into sort of a discussion a little bit about what some of the differences are between the 3 classifications, if you will. So for areas under SIG control, these are not governed homogeneously in terms of education delivery, although efforts are underway to standardize things as much as possible. The availability of teachers, classrooms, and materials is not consistent across those areas. Generally speaking, schools managed by the SIG are inconsistent in the curricula they use. Sometimes they use Government of Syria curricula, sometimes they use SIG curricula, which is sort of modified from the original curricula of the country. Many of the teachers in their schools receive a stipend from donor-funded initiatives so that they can be incentivized to stay teachers. Where the Syrian government remains in control, education services continue being delivered through governorate-level directorates of education. Schools use the official curricula, and students sit it for the grade 9 and grade 12 national examinations. As already mentioned, in some areas under the regime control, the system is burdened by large numbers of IDP children, causing schools to have double shifts with reduced hours of learning for each shift. Least known is information for areas under the control of extremist religious groups, such as ISIS. Many sub-districts in these areas other areas have heavily damaged schools or schools that have been converted into shelters or into bunkers for armed groups. In those areas, a revised version of the curriculum is taught. Chemistry and physics have been removed, and the hours dedicated to mathematics have been decreased as well. Like I said, we know the least about that because obviously it's hard to find reliable sources of data and information for it. So to drill down a little more deeply into that, so what does the system look like now? I've already talked, oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I apologize. All right, so I've already talked about inconsistent curricula within the country based on what entity is in control of what area. I've also mentioned the shortages in textbook and teaching materials, as well as the lack of data, for sure, are studies on learning outcomes. A lot of issues are at play in terms of the teacher workforce. The security situation is one issue, obviously. Another is remuneration, with low salaries or no salaries being a point of contention. Teachers, who teachers report to, who they work with, who they get paid by, is also unclear sometimes. So they may report to one type of authority, be paid by another authority, and teach curriculum from yet another source. Teachers also have reported feeling ill-equipped to handle the psychological needs of children who have been, have suffered from trauma because of the conflict. I've already touched on the lack of schools and poor classroom conditions due to bombardment, due to all sorts of factors. In terms of examinations, currently examination centers for grade 9 and grade 12 examinations can only be found in Government of Syria regime-controlled areas. That necessitates students to travel distances or cross through unsafe areas in order to be able to sit and take the examinations. The SIG actually administers its own baccalaureate examination in opposition-controlled areas, as well as in refugee camps in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. But the government of Syria's MOE does not recognize the exam, precluding its holders from being able to attend Syrian universities. At this point, I'll transition to look at the three governorates, Daraa, Idlib, and Aleppo, in more detail. So we are going to start with Daraa. The right top-hand corner of the slide outlines the major challenges, while the blue box text at the bottom of the slide lists a few of the education support programs that are being provided in that governorate currently. Education and officials in Daraa have found it difficult to maintain service delivery due to continued violence. They have high dropout rates as a result of out-migration. Schools are unsafe spaces. Continuous shelling has resulted in psychological issues for children, including delayed speech and urinary reflex. Boys at the secondary level drop out to either join to basically find employment and help support their families, or in some instances they even drop out in order to take up arms and join armed groups. 500 teachers were fired in Daraa because of their support or sympathy with the Syrian revolution. Other teachers in the governorate have left the country, while others have left to take jobs that actually pay a better living wage. Some of the initiatives that support education in Daraa are a UNICEF program that supports 100 school clubs providing remedial education for displaced children. The El Zaytoun Olive Tree Project manages 14 schools and a cultural center through which they organize computer, language, music courses while providing psychological support to children. There are also micro-initiatives started by individuals or communities that involve providing a few hours of schooling in someone's home or in an available safe space. Moving on to Idlib. Sorry, this keeps jumping around. Let me go back one. There we go. That's the slide for Idlib. Idlib has a lot of different groups controlling different parts of it, including the SIG, the government, the regime, Jaish al-Fatah, and then Nusra Front. It lacks the internal coherence with too many actors in the mix, creating a lot of confusion around the delivery of education. Because of a lack of resources to deliver education, Jaish al-Fatah, for example, has used government of Syria curricula in return for having the regime continue paying teachers' salaries. Other reports suggest that Jaish al-Fatah eliminated philosophy and history courses from the curriculum, but then reintroduced them when they realized that the national examinations test for them. In rural Idlib, they also eliminated music, art, and agriculture classes from the curriculum and instead put a greater emphasis on religious education. As you can imagine, the uncertainty and the environment has led many teachers to leave their posts, and according to the Ministry of Education, the governorate has a shortage of 11,000 teachers. So very briefly, some examples of education initiatives that are supported include the Viras initiative, which trains teachers on how to deal with their students' psychological issues. In partnership with Medical Relief Syria, they have also opened a number of regional counseling centers for children. The People in Need works closely with local councils to select temporary learning spaces for schooling, and because they work at the local council level, they've gained the trust of the communities to continue operating in those places and providing educational support to children. The Syria Child Protection Network has designed an accelerated curriculum that covers basic subjects. The Orient for Humanitarian Work is piloting an e-learning program with refugee students in Turkey and is planning to extend this model into Idlib. The Safe Healing and Learning Places is an IRC program that supports 12,000 children in internally displaced settlements. Moving on to Aleppo, which is the last governorate we tried to do a deep dive on. The data presented in this slide tells a very sad story, although one not necessarily ubiquitously the same for all of Aleppo. School and teacher shortages are endemic to the area, as is lack of safety. In Aleppo, the Syrian interim government oversees its own district of education, which is managing some 200 schools in opposition-controlled areas in the city of Aleppo and in the countryside of Aleppo. This district of education under the SIG employs 1,400 teachers who teach in those schools and has converted basements, mosques, caves, and even homes to schools in order to try to avoid the bombardment, which is continuous. Because of the blockade stifling Aleppo, there's a severe shortage of textbooks. Double shifting has been introduced in the calmer parts of Aleppo to accommodate the influx of displaced children. The result is a half-day reduction in schooling for all students and therefore less learning for sure. Teacher availability varies from one area to the other. As you can see from the slide, 70% of teachers working in opposition-controlled areas managed schools are volunteers, and some 30% of those volunteers receive remuneration in the form of a stipend, really. Examples of education initiatives that are active in Aleppo include IDARA, which is a district-funded project that is basically focused on improved governance, but also includes a component that provides teacher stipends in Aleppo and in other parts of Syria as well. Based on their qualifications, teachers are paid between $100 and $300 a month. UNICEF Safe Learning the SLP project, operates in Aleppo as well, and Save the Children has been working at the community level there to support schools and to provide education to children as well. So, this slide essentially is a summary a summarized form of what I have been presenting so far. And the issues we identified through the literature review and some of the interviews we did. Two additional points that I would like to make before bringing the presentation portion of this webcast to a close. The first is that most education programs supported by the donor community have been delivered within a relief and child welfare framework. This may be a natural tendency given the nature of the conflict, but in another 2, 3, maximum 4 years, a full generation of Syrian children will be left behind if more focus is not put on the sector. It's also important to note that only 37% of the sector's funding needs were met in 2014, and an even lower 20% in 2015. The second point is that this study generated interesting questions for our larger development community. Questions which I think can perhaps form a good starting point for the Q&A portion of this webcast. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention, and I now pass on to Jim to facilitate the last part of this webcast. Thank you.
Lena, thank you very much for this compelling and, yes, sad insight into the state of education in Syria. We do have one question that has come in from the chat area. I also have a question or two, and like you suggest, I think these three emergent questions certainly can inspire a bit of discussion and maybe more questions from the chat area. So maybe we take the very first question that has come in that we've been able to capture, and it's from Josh Joseph. Forgive me if I mispronounced the last name. And his question was, do you have a sense of how social inclusion factors, disability and gender, for instance, are being included into the proposed education frameworks? Perhaps we can lead off with that, and then I have a couple of questions I can follow on as well. So just a quick note to encourage everyone, please do send in your questions. Amy Deal, my colleague, and I and others, were capturing them as best as we can. And perhaps we go back to the other slide for your immersion questions there. Leave those up for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I can say that we looked at that particularly, and also the data and information we found was so limited as it was. What is actually unfortunate and understandable in this context is that disability, particularly physical and psychological disability, is on the rise because of what is happening. So when I talk about the psychosocial support, it's very much about that, but also extending to children who have disabilities to start with. Gender has been less of a problem historically in the Levant and in the recent past. However, the economic situation that the conflict is causing has reintroduced child marriage, and the reason for child marriage is that parents feel that if they marry off some of, I guess, one or more of their daughters, the daughters are secure with somebody who has a better income and at least may be able to survive the conflict. So we are seeing, in terms of what's going on in the classrooms and the schools, there does not really seem to be much difference who's dropping out, who's staying. It's except for the boys at the secondary level, which has an economic and unfortunately conflict-related roots, if you will. I hope that answers your question, but as I said, the data is not that available, nor is the information. It is very hard to conduct surveys inside Syria. It is very hard to know what's happening, and there's constant movement in terms of the situation. So what was true today may not be true tomorrow, may not be true the day after. Although the conflict continues to be true, obviously, that hasn't changed.
Okay, Nina, thank you. I can convey another question, this one from Kyle Friedman, and he asks, as part of this review and our current understanding of the current education system in Syria, was there analysis of non-formal learning centers and institutions that have resulted from the crisis? And if so, what do these look like?
There wasn't specifically a review of non-formal, but some of the education initiatives that I refer to, in a sense, some of them are in a non-formal setting because it's difficult to tell what is formal, what is informal, except that if you have a school happening in a school, then I guess it is formal. But there's so much happening that is going on in people's homes and supported by local NGOs that I think probably a lot of education is being delivered through the non-formal sector, and it's probably inconsistent. I mean, using curricula that are available, but who knows how well-trained or not the teachers are. So we don't have enough, we certainly didn't look at that in this context in great depth.
Okay, Nina, and I have a question, which is, what are your takeaways in terms of, did anything come through to you that surprised you, or what were the main things that, in any of these territorial areas, what were helping these school communities get by? You've mentioned international support, NGO activities. What was your sense of those, let me use the words, assets, or those areas of resilience that were just helping these schools just weather the huge amount of risk that that's been thrust on them? How are they getting by?
I honestly don't know. It does make you wonder. But I think it seems to me from sort of all the reports that I read and some of the conversations, the closer a school and its structure and its delivery is to the community, the more success and longevity that delivery system has. So, for example, some of the initiatives that are delivering education through local councils, where there are local councils outside of the government of Syria control areas, are being more successful, I guess, because the community is coming together to kind of support the whole process. But I think anything like that would require a closer look at the ground level, at least in as close as possible, if not ideally inside Syria, as to what are the stories and how is it happening and what is driving the engine when when schools or particular areas are managing to continue to provide education to children in very unstable conditions.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I've got two more questions to convey. One from Muslim Shah, and his question is, thank you for providing this information. If possible, could you please provide more details, further details, about how volunteers organize themselves in providing classes? Is it done individually in each community, or a bigger body organize the services in a non-formal setting?
Hi, yes. I don't know for sure, but I would assume, I think it's fair to assume from some of the things I read that it is done in different ways. Sometimes it's, people just volunteer in the sense that they are in a community and they want to help everyone in the community. Civil society and NGOs, some of which have grown out of this conflict and have grown because they want to provide services as best as they can across the board, not just in education, to their fellow Syrians, are probably the most active in organizing volunteers and recruiting volunteers, organizing volunteers, and probably managing volunteers and managing delivery of support services and relief efforts through a volunteer system.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions coming in from Yolande Muller-Granvaux from USAID. The question is, to what extent does the funding for education come from controversial / religious / radicalized sources?
We looked very hard for that information. That information was very hard to find. One presumes that in what we call other areas where more radical religious groups are in place, I think it's fair to assume that the funding comes from controversial, well, more than controversial, probably illicit means. And so for opposition-controlled areas, a lot of it is, some of it is donor-supported, I think. Some of it is supported by a lot of allies who are supporting that effort. But we tried to look and find answers to that question because I think USAID was very interested in that question as well, but that was not something you could find in the literature. I think it would require, so neither myself nor Badr went to any of these areas. We didn't go to Amman, that was not part of the parameters of the study we did. I think if you want to dig deeper, you would physically have to go there, I imagine, and ask more probing questions to find out.
Okay, thank you, Nina. Another question from Zilur Siddiqui. Are there any initiatives on unified accelerated curriculum for the system?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again?
Are there any initiatives on unified accelerated curriculum for the system?
There are accelerated initiatives. Unified across the board? No, I don't think there's, I think that's maybe something, that has to be considered. Part of the issue on the unified part, particularly where the regime is not in place, is that the boundaries keep moving. So what is used and then moves becomes less relevant. It's a very fluid environment, and that's kind of one of the reasons these emergent questions emerge, And so if you look at, for example, some other conflict areas that education has been delivered, it's usually maybe more under the control of one entity, so that although there's internal conflict, there's sort of an overarching management system, if you will, that's in place. But the problem here is that there are a lot of players in this space, and in some instances, they're micro players in micro spaces. So it makes it very difficult to reach consensus and momentum and even negotiation on things like this. I think it sounds like organically something's happened at the field level, but somebody would have to do, the whole of Syria is probably the best place to try to bring unification, but again, you're dealing with multiple entities that are in conflict. So, would anybody like to add anything?
You're doing great.
We have another question from Zaina. How valid do you believe the pre-conflict statistics are from the government of Syria? And additionally, we have seen very high percentages of children without basic literacy and numeracy skills, which do not follow a 90% enrollment rate pattern. Shall I repeat?
No, it's a good question.
Okay.
Well, enrollment doesn't mean you're learning. It just means you're there. So there's that. Like I said, I think the enrollment rates are probably, they might be off by a little bit, but I'm from the region and I kind of have an intuitive, I grew up, everybody sort of went to school, but what you learned at school is a whole different story. And if you even learn the basic competencies is not clear. These are systems that have a lot of examinations in the process. There are 2 national examinations, but there are a lot of examinations to move from primary to lower secondary to upper secondary and all that. And that's sort of where I think those children who maybe ended up with less basic competencies such as reading and mathematics made it successfully through the system. So, but the data we have is from the government's EMIS system, you know, which is like any government's EMIS system in a lot of parts of the Middle East. Relatively on track, but perhaps not absolutely precise.
Okay. We have a question from Michelle Bradford, and she asks, you've talked a lot about data. What is your read on the quality of data? What does the EMIS cover? And lastly, how timely and accurate are the data? And you've just touched on it right now, but I'll leave the question there for you.
Yeah, the data was an issue in the sense that certainly for everything, it's spotty. There's less reliable data for opposition-controlled areas and practically no reliable data for other areas. The most reliable, I mean, you know, comes from the government of Syria just because they have an EMIS, they have a structure in place, you know, they kind of have continued the operations they had. Now, how much of their EMIS is completely spot on, I don't know, given the conditions. But they have a system that they continue using, while the opposition-controlled areas, you know, the SIG does not have a system. They're trying to build a system and trying to put in this directorates of education or their equivalent to manage education systems, including doing assessments, one presumes, if the situation allows. So I would say the data, depending on what you're looking at, is okay to very unreliable. And that was part of our struggle. The only two sets of reliable in the sense that they were new and somebody had actually conducted a survey, data came from those two sets of reports, one from the UNICEF MENA regional office out of Damascus and the other one from the Assistance Coordination Unit out of Gaziantep, which tried to look at the quality of education and the inputs. But there hasn't been any other efforts because of the situation. And it's kind of hard to know what's going on if you're not in the place.
Okay, thank you, Nina. We have a question from Oraida, and the question is there an understanding, at least among NGOs, that their programs must include a psychosocial support component?
So, hello everyone, my name is Katie Booburn and I work for NEAC at the State Department. To kind of touch on that topic, a lot of the NGOs are beginning to incorporate psychosocial activities and support, and I can speak more towards the ones in Idlib and Aleppo. We've seen, you know, small community-scale activities that have actually been very successful in kind of addressing some of the needs, getting the community, both parents, leaders, and students involved in various activities. So it's starting. But, you know, it's very much a work in progress.
I have a question, and this really looks at our colleagues from USAID. Given you've commissioned the report, some very interesting findings, difficulty in obtaining data, but still very valuable insights, Chris. Can you speak to how you'll take forward the report, how it will help inform your work, either strategies or broader programming?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. USA does have support for humanitarian assistance based in Amman, and we do partner a lot with our State Department colleagues mainly in southern Turkey, Gaziantep. So, well, I mean, as we've started. I mean, we do provide some support to education directorates and teachers, a little bit of teacher training, trying to keep classrooms in teachable conditions, addressing some of the psychosocial issues as you just heard. However, you know, we're very interested in thinking through how to bridge this humanitarian work to more of the development, you know, activities. As this crisis has gone on and on and on, as Nina already said, we realized that to only do humanitarian assistance is not enough. So we're trying to use a study like this to help further our thinking, and if the timing is right, if the funding comes through, to be able to think more strategically about how we can really deliver more solid education programming inside Syria. But it's all to be determined really at this point.
No, thank you, Chris. We have another question that's come in from Zaina, and the question is, was there any special attention given to the Kurdish-controlled areas? Were they still considered as part of SIG, while we know that they are not and they operate independently and run their own curricula and education systems?
Okay. So, no, we did not look at those particular areas. Those were not included in our scope of work and in our efforts.
And just a reminder to everyone, we have a few more minutes left. We can take perhaps one or two more questions. I, for one, Nina, just to offer a comment, I'm very interested to see what would be those opportunities for moving from relief to development programming, and what could realistically be done on the ground when we're talking about either working on systems, developing capacities, given that it is still very much open conflict where those opportunities may exist. And what I might do is then move quickly. We do have one more question. I want to make sure we can attend to the questions coming in from people. Another question from Zena. Also, you mentioned not sharing the report because it has sensitive interviews. Are or were there any attempts to still share the findings with the local relevant stakeholders, parenthetically local councils, local NGOs, etc., to feed into their processes of building and developing their programming?
Actually, we haven't done that yet, and that's a great point, and we absolutely need to do that. In particular, we put together a smaller summary to hope that, in the hope that it'd be a little more digestible to read and a quick reference, especially with the annotated bibliography and the hot links to other resources, which could really be seen as a little bit of a tool in some cases. So yes, we will do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I have a question from Michelle Bradford. Were you able to undertake any reviews or spot checks of the curricula in use?
No, we did not.
Okay, and I'll just jump to the next one to make sure we can sneak this in. Again, from Yolande Miller-Ranvaux. To what extent are donors coordinated in terms of education approaches, content, geographically, etc.?
So just recently, this is Katie again, apologies. Just recently, over the past probably year or so, on the donor level, we've been able to coordinate with others to kind of make sure that we're not duplicating efforts. Our projects and our efforts are kind of layered. They complement one another. Most of the stuff and most of the work that we've done inside Syria in the education realm with other donors have been in Aleppo and Idlib. We're definitely looking to kind of expand both geographically as well as in the scope of our work moving forward. Again, pending funding levels kind of from each of the donors.
Okay, I think we'll need to stop there, and thank you for all of the very good questions that came in. For anyone who still has a question, or if a question comes up in your mind after we've closed the webcast, please send your questions to us at USAID ECCN. My colleague Amy is putting it into the chat box, but I'll say it here now, USAID ECCN altogether at edc.org, and we will work those into the web page and share them with Nina and Chris and others to see that we can respond to them. For now, I just want to express our gratitude to Nina and to Chris for all your good work for helping orchestrate this webcast. A few people would argue that the crisis and the conflict in Syria is one of the, if not the biggest priority for us as an international community, and we're grateful to have these insights into what's going on. So thank you very much. Again, if you haven't signed up for USAID ECCN, please do, and follow the website for continued blogs and discussions emanating from this very useful webcast. So thank you very much.